What's up, everybody? Welcome back to How We Got Here. This is a deep dive look at racism in America. My name is Justin Avery, and I'm from Waypoint Church here in Santa Barbara. Our goal here in this series is to help others identify how racism functions in our society today. We believe that if you can see it for yourself, you'll be a much better advocate against it. Hey man, how about that last episode though? I know we've been dropping a bunch of bombs here, and it might take some time to process this. It's a lot. It's not easy stuff. I get it. Another thing here is I know it's very easy to misunderstand what we're saying. So before moving forward, let's recap to make sure that we're being really clear. Okay? I get a lot of feedback on the things that we're doing here, and this one statement I get the most. If you are white in America, you are a racist. And more often than not, what they hear me say is, because you're white, you're a racist. In other words, your skin color makes you a racist. Now, you'll be happy to learn that nothing can be further from the truth. Let me expound on that thought for a second. So, if you're white, the color of your skin doesn't make you a racist any more than the color of my skin makes me less intelligent or dangerous at night or more athletic. No human being is born a racist, no matter what color you are. And your skin color can't turn you into a racist. The system that you were born into, though, here in America, yeah, that can definitely turn you into a racist. And that's exactly what it was designed to do. Guys, and that's exactly what it did. You see, what we're saying here is that if you're white in America, you were born into a system that chose you. And it began your racial socialization the day you opened your eyes. And you've been receiving that training every day since, without your consent, without your knowledge, without your input. And in that way, we were all socialized into beliefs and behaviors that undeniably produce a society of white superiority and all the conditions that go along with that. And that outcome is neither debatable nor escapable. It's just where we live, guys. So you see, this isn't exactly something that you can be blamed for. You didn't create it, I didn't create it. But although you didn't create it as a white person, although you didn't create it, you were still trained to perpetuate it, whether you're aware of the fact that you're doing it or not. And that's the racism part that we're trying to undo. That's the part that we're trying to bring to your attention. And my hope in telling you this horrible information is that you will rise too and meet that challenge of undoing it as well. It's going to take some processing. It takes some digging. It takes research and some time and some patience. But I'm asking you to care enough about this to make it a priority. Because as long as it continues unchanged on a heart level, it's going to continue to hurt people. And I know that's not what most of us want. So we're not just here trying to make people feel bad. The goal is to make you aware of what's been done to you, how it was done, and how to recognize it when you see it happening to somebody else. So that should you disagree with how our system is functioning in our lives, then you can now be in a position to change it, beginning with yourself. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope that's clear. But again, we are all up for conversation on this, so let's talk. But for now, though, we're going to talk about the function of racism. What is it? If you cut the gas line of the engine of a car, it'll stop the car from running. And similarly, if you remove the wheels, car won't move an inch further, or unless, of course, you replace the wheels. Now, if you unscrew those two screws at the top of the battery and you detach those cables, it'll never start. Or let's say, for instance, you take the coolant out of the radiator. You just run all that water out of there. It'll take a couple of minutes after running it, but soon the engine will heat up to temperatures hot enough to melt that engine block, causing it to freeze and no longer function. Don't ask me how I know that. But the point is when you know how a structure functions, what makes it go, when you know how it's put together, or you know how it comes apart, when you know that kind of information, then you then have the power to either maintain it, to repair it, or to stop it from functioning altogether. Why? Because you understand how it does what it does. And similarly, if you understand and can accept the role that you played in a racist system, then you can inherently understand how to undo your role and ultimately help others undo theirs. But the question we want to get at here today is about function. How exactly does a racist system produce white superiority? What propels it forward? And where's the battery? Where's the wheels? Where's the gas line in a racist society? Because I want to unplug that bad boy, right? So we know the system works because we see the product. What we want to know is how does it work? And we're going to talk about that here. So the racist system, it consists of 5 branches of society that function to serve the purpose of creating white superiority. Now, the 5 branches are this. It's our government, our media, our law enforcement, our education, and our public opinion. And these are the 5 pieces of machinery working within the system that propel it forward, if you will. So these 5 branches comprise what we know of as our culture. Now, what that means is that racism is a culturally created and culturally driven system. And if it was created culturally, then it can be uncreated culturally. In other words, if racism was built by the government, media, law enforcement, education, and public opinion, then the only way to unbuild it or to tear it down or to change it are going to be on those 5 same methods. Now, one of the things I realize here about our society, about these branches, is that they're institutions. They're systems within a system. And the idea of trying to change one of those things is absolutely overwhelming. But the good news is this. The foundation of a culture, the common root that energizes all 5 of these branches of systemic racism is people, just like you and me. So, and why is that important? It's important because it means that its gas line, the battery, the wheel, or whatever it is, that vital element that it all runs on, is accessible to you and me. People whose minds can change today if they had a reason to, and if only someone spoke to that. And if the people change, the culture changes. And if the culture changes, that means that government, media, law enforcement, education, public opinion, it all changes, all of it. So you and I are actually, it might seem overwhelming, but you and I are absolutely right where we need to be if changing our culture is our intention. So let's dive under the hood and see how this thing is actually functioning, okay? So, whether you are in the digital realm or in society, whether you're in it doesn't matter what it is, every system is created and designed to meet a specific purpose. And racism isn't any different. To fully understand how a racist system or any system is built, you first need to be really, really super clear on what purpose it was built to serve, because the purpose that a system was designed for will put into perfect context why it does all of its smaller objectives. In other words, it'll give us clarity as to why all the components of a system function within the system the way that they do. Why do they do what they do? Why do the wheels spin? Why the battery sends electricity throughout the system? Why the radiator circulates water? You'll understand why those things do what they do when you know the overall purpose of the car, which is to drive, right? So then that begs the question, what is the function of racism then? Why is racism designed? What's its purpose? What is it designed to accomplish? The best place to go is to one of the authors of racism, and is the president of the Confederacy and white supremacist, Alexander Hamilton Stevens. And he said in 1861 that the Negro is he's not equal to the white man. That slavery, subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. Now, everybody's entitled to their opinion, I suppose, but suffice it to say, when the African people got brought to the New World, they didn't know that little bit of information about their status, much less agree with its premise once somebody told them. But the purpose of the system was clear, though. They needed to drive black people down to a level of humanity that fit the description that white people were trying to assign to them, fulfilling their own prophecy, if you will. They needed them to be less than human in order to properly function within the society they had envisioned. And that was to create a social structure composed of a superior race with another people of inferiority, or another inferior race whose sole existence was to bow down and serve them and do their work for them. That was the basic premise behind that society. That's the function. That's why it was designed, is to accomplish that, to reduce the humanity of a race. And all 5 elements, all 5 branches within that system, they all serve that purpose. Knowing this function will explain why our systems do what they do and why they produce the conditions that they produce. They're doing their job. Notice the word hate does not come into play here. Racism is a system. It's not about how I feel about you or how you feel about me. It's about producing a product, and the product is white superiority. And if you go back and look at Hamilton Stevens' entire speech, the word hate is never mentioned because it's not about hate. Racism, ironically, is about love for yourself, and all others be damned. And everything racism does drives towards that. The method to accomplish this is called subjugation. And what it means, I looked it up in dictionary.com, it means to bring under complete control or to make submissive or subservient, to enslave. You see, the South, they lost the Civil War, so they weren't allowed to keep slavery intact. And a lot of people think racism ended when the war ended. Slavery might have ended. But we got to be clear to point this out, that there was never a war ever fought on American soil that contested the idea of white superiority. In other words, slavery was outlawed, but white supremacy was not. Both the North and the South were in lockstep on that one point. You know, they were still very superior to black people after that war, both sides, because from a black perspective, if you look at it from that end of things, in that day, and you can read the testimonies from that day as well, freedom from slavery did not free them from oppression or the subjugation that they felt whether they moved to the North or whether they remained in the South. Look up vagrancy laws. Yeah, they pulled some crazy stuff on them. The point here is the subjugation of the black race was the purpose of the racist system, even after the Civil War. And throughout history until the present day, we see it legally functioning in all 5 major branches of society. So, pre-civil rights, we saw all kinds of legal ways that our society used to subjugate black people. We saw Jim Crow laws, redlining, voter suppression laws, miscegenation laws, vagrancy laws, as we spoke about, FHA policy, how they gave out house loans, lynchings, cross-burning, the KKK was formed, segregation, bombings, assassinations, and the list just goes on and on and on. But what is interesting is that the civil rights movement, when it came along in the 60s, it forced the more violent aspects of subjugation by the system to evolve into something more kind of covert and indirect. Something you and I are a little bit more used to seeing today. Interestingly, these non-violent methods of subjugation, they proved to be far more effective and far more foundational to the function of racism without drawing as much criticism from the opposition. In other words, the violence kind of calmed things down. And being indirect, the methods are harder to identify and harder to dismantle, so you can be racist without knowing it. It displays a much prettier face and hides under the radar of some while achieving the same goal of suppression. So we asked the question earlier, where's the gas line, the battery and the wheels of racism? We're going to go over a list here of some of the main ways systemic racism serves its function. This is the part where we define how it does what it does and gets to where it's going. This is where we give a name to each of those functions. And the first is a function that's called the white power of authority. Okay, so the white power of authority is a perspective, and it says, this is going to sound crazy, but stick with me on this. So as a white person, I am the center. My world was tailor-made to suit me. I'm entitled to the environment that caters to my social comfort, my status, and my benefit. No other racial groups are allowed to legitimately contest or compete with these benefits. Therefore, I'm the authority. I, and people who look like me, are the ones who get to dictate the rules of society and the social structures. This places me as a white person in a position to determine whose opinions, whose feelings, whose experience, and which facts are valid, where people live, what justice looks like, and the like. The experience, the wisdom, the seniority, or knowledge of a lower race is not enough to outweigh the power of my final word, even if I'm not as well informed. Yeah, few people would dare to say these phrases out loud because, frankly, they're absurd. Embarrassing, actually, if you ever heard somebody actually say that. But people of color, we see these phrases being belted out on a daily basis in society without ever making a sound. For example, the movie industry rarely has non-white superheroes. And the actual practice of doing so only began in the 90s, really. Why? At least in the mainstream. What is the message that industries are sending when they create these worlds and these visuals that only have white people in positions of power, playing the heroes or at the center of focus? I can tell you how the message lands upon the black community. What it says to us is that this world is not for you. It creates a set of social rules that are never to be crossed. And interestingly, evidence for the presence of these rules are revealed when someone comes along and breaks those rules. For example, when Black Panther was released in 2018, a couple of years ago, a lot of white people were upset about it, and they took to the internet, man, and they were complaining that, and you can look it up, they took to the internet and they were complaining that there were too few white people in it and that it was reverse racist. It was a shock to the system. They were responding to the fact that this movie was so popular and as mainstream as it was, but it wasn't about them. See, it broke the unstated rule that you're not supposed to make mainstream movies that are not centered around white people. People who have the power of authority, they get to declare what is of inherent value and what is not. Naturally, we're socialized to believe the white experience has more inherent value than anything that comes from other races. Power behind whiteness has meaning, and we're all conditioned to believe that white people are better, they're cleaner, they're smarter, they're more capable than others, despite evidence to the contrary. In other words, the voice of the white person can be trusted as authoritative on a topic more than a black person or a person of color. The civil rights movement is a classic case of the white power of authority. The issues brought up and successfully litigated in the 1960s were issues that black people were fighting for and speaking up about for generations. Yet, once white people began to stand up and say the same thing, people began to listen. And ultimately, white people signed the Civil Rights Bill into law. No black person was there to sign that bill. And the white power of authority is found in all 5 branches of a racist system. It's difficult to recognize white crimes, bigotry, and other injustices when you have already been socialized to believe that white people are inherently good. When you believe that, they can be excused for more behaviors than they probably should. Essentially, when you're taught that the world revolves around white people, you are free to enjoy many advantages that no one else can. One of the areas we see this most clearly is in America's rape culture. Our judicial system has a very bad track record of finding excuses for it and downplays it, allowing criminal white men to proceed unchecked for their behavior. Look up Brock Allen Turner, 2015. You've heard the sayings, boys will be boys. He's just a kid, everyone makes mistakes, everyone deserves a second chance. Deep down, he's a good person. You know, you hear these statements often, especially in the court of law when it comes to this type of thing. You know, in the rape case of Brock Turner at Stanford University, the court explicitly cared more about his future and his career potential than they did about the woman he raped and damaged for life. They were more concerned about that. Historically, the courts have conspicuously not offered the same degree of leniency when addressing the misbehavior of people of color. In the mid-1900s, it was not uncommon for a mob to castrate and lynch black men simply on the suspicion of sexual misconduct. Upholding the fundamental goodness of white people is vital to justifying white superiority. To admit the fullness of the category of bloodshed, as James Baldwin describes it, it would be to admit the fallacy of the inherent goodness of all white people. The fact is that they're just people, and they do wicked things too. But this fallacy is responsible for the death of innocent people, and it has allowed incredibly horrible people to be free to do as they will to society, to black people or white people alike. Shielding white people from impartial accountability in an effort to maintain this social ideology of goodness has been catastrophic to all who live in the United States. Even white people would benefit from getting rid of this belief in our system. Next to racism, I believe that the American standard of beauty is one of the most merciless and cruel aspects of our society. It's often, but not certainly limited to, favoring Aryan traits while considering traits of color ugly or less desirable. At the very least, the American media is not prone to considering different races and the traits that they bear as normal. The word that comes to my mind is exotic, but it's never normal. The fact that we have to constantly remind ourselves and our school children that differences are good and normal, it makes a strong case that the presence of this esteem-crushing dynamic in our country is far more present than it should be. As integrated as we are, we still don't actually value people of color like we value people who are white. And it's not just entertainment. Dehumanization is even communicated in the way we name our food. Consider angel food cake versus devil's food cake. Now notice the colors and the words associated with them. Guys, it's everywhere. Again, Google the phrase the doll study. I keep bringing that study up. This heartbreaking study conducted in the 70s shows how we are trained as early as 3 years old to identify who in America is beautiful and who in America is ugly, who has value and who doesn't, who's good and who's bad. And these poor black children, they were convinced that they were ugly human beings. By the time they're barely out of their diapers, they were convinced of this. I'm going to ask you something. Where in the world could they have possibly been taught that? But the point here is that the dehumanization process begins well before you ever get a chance to decide for yourself. And by the time you're putting on big boy underwear or big girl underwear, you already believe in it. Okay, so the next one is called industry standards. Now, it's not a racist thing to start a manufacturing company. Let's take Band-Aids, for example. I'm always coming back to that example. There's nothing wrong with making Band-Aids. However, by the very design of what you manufacture, you can be propagating the furtherance of racial dehumanization. Toy dolls, makeup, food, packaging, labeling, marketing, and on and on and on and on. And again, to be fair, this has gotten much better in the last 10 years. But comparatively, the point is still being overwhelmingly made nonetheless. They're looking at a sea of names and faces on products, none of which resemble themselves. And it tells them, we may allow you to live here, but society is not made for you. You are less than us, and you are not important enough to create and maintain a space for. That they are all, at all times, being reminded that black people are not 100% accepted in their own country. Now, I don't think changing the face of Aunt Jemima is going to do anything to end racism. But that's not the point of me telling you this. The point is that dehumanization is the goal. And if we change the culture from trying to deliver white superiority to its people, things like this will naturally change in ways that I think will surprise us all. Education. Our school systems were set up to be funded by taxpayer money, much of which came by income tax and property taxes. Racism severely limited black people from participating in normal citizen life that would have produced either. Thus began a systemic gutting of black life in America that we're still reeling from in 2020. It began with jobs after the emancipation of the slaves. They couldn't get regular jobs since most business establishment wouldn't even allow them through their front door. This placed them in extremely low income brackets. Secondly, in 1934, the Federal Housing Administration, they developed a risk rating system deeming black neighborhoods not good investments for federally backed mortgages. In essence, black people were kept from moving into white neighborhoods. They would never let them go there. But they were also prevented from buying homes in their own neighborhoods, even if they had the money and they could afford it. Now, also, the GI Bill promised home loans to veterans. Nearly 8 million World War II veterans had received education or training, and 4.3 million home loans. Now that was worth $33 billion. So it was just, all that money, $33 billion worth of things were handed out, but they were denied the 1.2 black veterans. They were not allowed to buy those homes, and therefore tax money allotted to their segregated school systems were very, very low, because they didn't have great property taxes or income tax. And there was no effort made to rectify that. The GI Bill also guaranteed a pay for higher education, but blacks weren't allowed into most of the colleges that they were supposed to be able to go to due to their race. They couldn't even get in the front door. So where education was concerned, they were completely left behind.
African American wealth today is 10% of white wealth. That enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy practiced in the mid-20th century that has never been remedied. It's a constitutional violation, and of course it determines the ongoing racial inequalities we have today.
So now, it should begin to make sense. What might have happened next? You guessed it. Black kids were blamed for being stupid. They were less intelligent for not being up to speed with the white kids. And their parents were denied jobs due to inadequate education. And down the rabbit hole goes. And you can just play that out and guess what effect that situation might have had on black communities over a couple of generations. It killed them. It put them in situations that they couldn't get out of. War propaganda is where you see this method of suppression used in the most obvious way. But it's everywhere, including in systemic racism. Dehumanization serves to remove the assumption of humanity from the targeted race. Why is this important? Well, Sun Tzu, he wrote a book called The Art of War. He's a war general, 10,000 years ago almost. And one of his 5 principles of winning war required in order to secure victory is to maintain the hearts and minds of the people in your country. If you lose their support, there will be no way for you to win the war or to achieve whatever you're trying to achieve. The public will never support the brutal killing of people that they see as human. But if they seem inhuman, or if they're desensitized to the slaughter, they might allow it. So, it's important to convince your own people that the enemy is less than human, animals, not worthy of saving. The most intentional and obvious place we find this form of dehumanization in America is in our very own United States Constitution. The 3/5 Compromise is found in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 of the United States Constitution. And it reads as follows. It says, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, and 3/5 all other persons. That is in our United States Constitution. At that time, it was 1787, the only other persons in America that were described here were slaves. And according to the Constitution, black people are only counted as 3/5 a human being. Now, some have argued that this was simply for tax purposes, but it's hard to make that argument though, when it is documented that they also used this clause to keep blacks from the right to vote, because they weren't men. Only men who were equal under the law could vote. Black people were not human beings completely. Some also say that the intention was not to allow the South from being overrepresented, thus guaranteeing the continuation of slavery. However, this argument strangely ignores the obvious, that if slaves had representation, then they should have the right to vote for their representation in Congress. And it was clear that's not what they wanted. So the effort to chivalrize the efforts of congressional suppression, it kind of falls flat on its face here. No, they were considered less than human. And we know that's true because they were treated less than human. It's consistent. You know, adding amendments to the United States Constitution isn't easy. And despite whatever the intentions were, all we can do really is deal with the outcome it produced in the end. And it was this: the 3/5 clause taught white Americans how their relationship with black people was supposed to function. It taught them that those who walk among them, those of color, they are less than you, and they are to be treated as such. White Americans were given authority through this law to fulfill that function as they saw fit. And we know this because that's exactly what Americans did moving forward once they got notice that this was what they could do. The clause taught that white people were endowed with the authority to judge the value of other human beings based on whatever they felt it to be at the time. And the verdict was this: less than human. Now, the temptation is to kind of blow that off as ancient history, but not so fast. The same arrogance that was used to justify the brutal regime of slavery, and this is the same arrogance that believes that black people shouldn't get paid as much as white people for the same type of work. It's the same type of arrogance that believes that they should get harsher prison sentencing for the same crimes as white people, or simply determining if their opinion or their experience matters as much as a white person's, and therefore not as worthy to share in the same benefits that whites offer to themselves. Dehumanization is the heartbeat of a racist system, and it informs every other branch of the system to behave the way that it does. And it does so by lowering the social position of people of color in order to justify unequal treatment, mistreatment, and enslavement. So guys, dehumanization is a major component of the system's method of creating racism. It's the part of the system that makes every other part of the system okay to do. It's the legitimizer. It's what excuses poor behavior towards others. Historically, there has been an inordinate and unexplained amount of brutality and killings of black people at the hands of police. This isn't a new thing. Now, many people ascribe to why they believe that is. Racism is often the go-to. But let me explain it another way. My grandmother told me a story about what she experienced and what she saw when she was 11 years old. There was a local steel mill in her town, and the kids all played near there. Her friend, a young black boy, he was getting into some mischief, as what preteens do. And he took a piece of steel from the steel yard, and he tried to go sell it back to the steel mill that he stole it from, probably enough to buy some candy. Well, they caught him in the act, and they called the police, and the police came and beat that 11-year-old kid to death in the middle of the street, and right there in front of all his friends. It was 80 years ago now, and my grandmother says she could never get that visual and that experience out of her mind. Not that the police were brutal, I mean, that was obvious, but the feeling that to them, we as black people were not worth much more than that treatment. She says the only difference now that she sees is that they're using guns in 2020 instead of batons. But the violence and the willingness to be violent over things that are not life-threatening is a side point. Because when you step back at it and you look and you see that story, it's an 80-year-old story, but you can see that there are countless stories like that being told all the way up until 2020. And we can see it as black people. We can see it with our own eyes that white people do not experience the same outcomes for the same type of interactions, the same crimes. When it's been this consistent for this long, a message becomes undeniably clear. It communicates unquestionably to black people that black human being is not worth the benefit of your doubt. He is not worth sparing, he is not worth mercy, and he's not worthy of redemption. See, this is the textbook definition of dehumanization in a racial context. And when the value of someone's life descends beyond a certain level, it's easy to justify killing them. When the value is zero, you won't have a problem killing them any more than you would have a problem killing a bug. But here's the bottom line. No one destroys objects of great value quickly or easily. But when there's no value, it's just trash. And that's kind of the point, and we get it. I think that they need to be taught to value life, especially black life. Because as the rest of society, it seems that they've been taught and instructed to dehumanize it. The only reason for that kind of behavior is if they were taught to. And that needs to be untaught. The purpose of the American system since its founding has always included the subjugation of black people. It's why it was built the way it was built. And when you see people, laws, policies, treating people as if they are worth less, that their opinions or their lives or their expertise or their experience, their families, their safety, their education, or their future, when it's all worth less than the dominant race, it's because the system is doing exactly what it was programmed to do so long ago. You see, systemic racism is extremely complicated. It's a network of processes. But its principles, they're consistent. Its function and its methods are predictable. And in every branch of our culture, they all serve the exact same function. When someone wants to pass a law based on a racially dehumanizing perspective, you'll see through it. You'll be able to make discerning judgments when you vote or when you decide who's worth voting for. When you discuss it with family, with friends, and you go about your daily life, you'll understand now why people say what they're saying and how their behavior actually functions. What is it serving to do? That people are using when they make laws or when they make racist jokes or when they say racist things and interact differently with people of color. So learn it, know it, teach what I'm teaching you, particularly to your white friends and families. That's how we change the culture. When we change the culture, our people will find a way to make the system match the changes. That's how systems are built. That's how racism was built. And that's how we will change and build the next system. So, that's our discussion for the day. We hope this better prepares you for the task of making a better world. I know it's a lot to chew on. It's a whole lot to chew on, so feel free to reference the text in the discussion in the description below. Don't forget to like and to share this discussion with your friends. So until next time, I love you. We'll talk soon.